Hello, dear friends. Good morning, good evening, good night, good afternoon. We welcome you to the next talk show in Shannon Gallery's studio. And today we are going to have a talk with a man whose name has become a symbol of virtuosity, of love for classical melodies and for music. He is a lecturer, musicologist, violinist, pianist, a man whose name is intertwined with incredible passion for the classics. Today we welcome Mikhail Kazinik. Hello, Mikhail.
Hello.
But nevertheless, the main idea of our stream today is to talk about your future school. And the first question probably goes like this. What should be changed in the school of the past to make it a school of the future?
Well, you don't have to change math, you don't have to change physics, you don't have to change chemistry. It's going to be very easy to explain. Because somebody's going to think, break it down, take it away. As communists said, we will destroy this world down to the foundations, and then we will build our new world. No. The school of the past had sometimes good teachers, very useful subjects. But it lacked the most important things. There was no panoramic vision of the world. We send our children to school for 10, 11, 12 years for 6 hours a day. And after these years, for 6 hours a day, we expect our kids to become a miracle of the divine, a poetry maniac, a musicomaniac, a man of the Renaissance with the richest speech, a person who knows the sonnet and the history of the sonnet and Petrarch and Dante and the Divine Comedy and Bach and the Reformation and its influence on human intellect. Our kids should know all that because we had sent them to teachers 12 years ago. And we never think why for so long. These 12 years are the best years of life when a kid's memory is maximum. The emotion of perception is enormous. And suddenly, talk to most graduates, whether in Russia or in America or in France, and you are suddenly surprised. The impression is that everything they studied has gone with the wind after graduation. And they are just ordinary, very ordinary persons. Their speech demonstrates they didn't study, they didn't learn, they didn't pass, they understood nothing, they felt nothing. Therefore, either this person is stupid. Let's say this one, or the school didn't do something. Why didn't it do something? What didn't it do? That's what we have to talk about. Because the school itself and its subjects. You see, there is no such thing as communist math or capitalist physics. All these subjects are absolutely objective. They are connected with the universe, with the processes occurring in all substances, in the air, in the vacuum, and so on. No harm if you just study it, but there is one special detail that prevents a person from becoming what he should be after 10 or 12 years of study. It is the lack of connection between objects, phenomena, and concepts. Let it be a kind of a joke, conventionally speaking. Imagine a student in the geography class. The geography teacher is talking about the geography of Africa. And a young man is told about African minerals, is shown some documentaries. Any kind of media can be helpful for students today. All we want is at our disposal. After that, a student has a history class, and in history he has the Great French Revolution today. He listens to all the stories of the French Revolution, how it all began and how it ended, and about Thermidor, and about everything, absolutely, and about the guillotine that was used day and night at that time. An hour later, having been filled with all these impressions about Africa, and then the history of the French bourgeois revolution, a student is to go to the gym for physical training. Jumping up and down is like an erasing rewind. The heads get clear again. Sweep it all away together with French Revolution and Africa. And after the gym, they have a literature class. And today at the lesson, the teacher is going to tell about a Russian poet, Alexander Pushkin, who is much talked about nowadays because he had the indiscretion to write 2 poems to praise the Russian emperor just to get the permission to go abroad. Yes, Pushkin did it in spite of his soul. He decided to flatter the Tsar, and now nobody needs anything in Pushkin's poetry. Only these poems are quoted. And the poems are terrible and disgusting from the point of view of poetry and disgusting from the point of view of... When I tell it, I recall a story about one comprehensive waveform lesson in my school, the school that has been created in Moscow, and it's open. There are wonderful children there, and they tell all sorts of interesting stories. Discoveries. So it turns out a very interesting thing. What happened to the mind of a child or a teenager? What has he realized as a result of all these lessons, as a result of this cooking recipe? You see, he realized one amazing thing, that the French Revolution, of course, took place in Africa and that its leader was Alexander Pushkin. And even the quote is given from his verses. Under the sky of my Africa, Pushkin himself recognized that Africa was his and he belonged to it. And under its sky, he felt the whole spirit of it, and so on. And if a researcher starts to deeply investigate Pushkin's work, he will really confirm that he was genetically African, and these genes helped to create such a unique image of the poet. On the one hand, a Slavic poet who speaks Russian, the richest language of the Slavic peoples, an unprecedented language. And on the other hand, you see, everything will be intertwined in students' minds, everything will be mixed up in a pile. They will eventually forget Pushkin's Africa, and the mineral resources of Africa, and the details of the French Revolution. Unless some of them decide to become a scientist and study the French Revolution. That is the school of ordinary consciousness. I call it the school of clip consciousness. A child, a boy, a girl gets a clip, a piece, a torn out piece, just detached from everything. After all, what is school? School is a scale, and a scale is a music as well. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, e. It's a scale. Consistency, climbing from bottom to top. That's what a school is. Do you understand? School means rest in ancient Greek. Even more interesting, a rest, but we keep saying work, work, work. Learning is not a rest. Wow. Interesting. Maybe it really is. That is, a child goes to school not to work hard. Now, many teachers, when they hear things like that, they start shaking with anger. They say they are scoundrels who discredit the school. But in fact, the most real work is an easy work. It is an easy breathing. It is light. It is the joy of learning, not the sadness and bitterness of learning. I have met various great scientists in my life, fortunately, and among my friends there was Yakov Rodina. It was he, I think, who at the age of 25 became head of the Department of Mathematics at a Belarusian university. 25 years old. He had already written his PhD thesis. He would have had his doctoral dissertation ready. And, he started collaborating. He spoke good French. He started collaborating with the Sorbonne. And one day we are sitting with him in the village. He liked to take me to his village, such a wonderful Belarusian village. He drove me there, a real village house, and we eat and drink and everything like that. And then he wakes up in the morning, he cannot have more drink because he had it the evening before. And today he has to drive. So he sits a little gloomy, holds a piece of paper in front of him and fills in the formulas in small, small handwriting, small. He says, "Oh, Misha, you can't imagine what a blow it's going to be for my Sorbonne's friends. Now I'll send it to them on the internet, and tomorrow they'll start teaching it and start discussing it." That's how he worked. I'm a completely non-drinking person, but with him, I love to drink. You know why? Because he made toasts, and each toast was connected with some great poet, with some quote of some poems, whether it was Maximilian Voloshin, or Alexander Bloch, or Boris Pasternak, or Joseph Mandelstam. My friend is a man in general from a village background. His parents never realized who he was. I can even tell a funny story about Yakov Rodina. One day he had a meeting of the Department of Mathematics, and suddenly he had an incoming call. It was his mom. And mom says, "Yasha, go home." "What is it, mom?" "My horse has run away." Yasha says, "Mommy, I'm sitting at a department meeting. We're discussing interesting things, questions. What are you discussing?" "Go home to catch a horse." So mom thinks that Yasha is the best person to catch a horse, and it was impossible to convince her otherwise. "Man is the younger brother. Let him catch, he's there with you." "Well, he's working," says mom. That is, she is convinced that her elder son is a loser, an academician, that he does not work. You're writing some kind of scribbles there. "And that's what work your brother works, so go home and catch a horse." It's such a paradoxical phenomenon. So if I were to teach a math class through him, I would definitely tell this story. You know why? Because the brain has a special ability. When the brain is tuned to the most complex mathematical matters, a person becomes a little bit moody. He starts to have a little bit of a headache because he is not in a mathematical state all the time. He is not a professional mathematician yet. It is not yet known what kind of path he will choose. So this is the story that will lead to these scribbles, because Yakov Rodina was a great applied mathematician. He did applied mathematics. And thanks to him, I understood so many things. If we meet at school somewhere in Russia and America, I don't know where, I'll show you mathematical tricks that will make you want to keep working forever. Do you understand? Just not to stop working.
Mikhail. While I was studying you, while I was watching your interviews, I discovered a new science. It will probably make you laugh a little bit. I called it Kazinikology because it is absolutely something new that people can study as a separate field. Because your arguments are unique, they are very useful. The views you expound throughout your interview, for example, immerse a person completely. Me too. That is, while I was watching your interviews, I never once felt like eating, sleeping, drinking, and so on. I was completely immersed in your streams.
You're just intuitively right, because back when we lived in the Soviet Union, I always worked in the kitchen. We had a big kitchen that was separated from the whole apartment by 2 doors and a corridor, and I was alone there. And I spent the whole night writing, for example, poems, books, philosophical essays. So I noticed that I didn't drink a single cup of tea or a cup of coffee. I didn't eat any food. I didn't feel like eating meat or whatever. I felt all my human needs were switched off. You see, I was no longer living as an organism with ordinary needs. I lived as a person who completely immerses himself in the subject, which interests him more than eating, sleeping, drinking, and so on. You're right, you felt that. I never wanted to do anything else when I was writing and working either. And it's all very interesting, and it leads to other categories of school. So what is the basis for the idea that I teach other teachers? I don't build schools, I don't develop a brand new concept of school. Although the main concept has been developed, of course. My idea is that there is nothing in the world detached from the past and the future. Every existence of every point in space. I mean, this point has arisen as a result of a previous movement. It came to us from somewhere from the past. We met it, we embraced it, and we begin to connect with it, to develop it, its themes, its ideas. And its further movement into the future depends on how we deal with it. So we are now beginning to think, well, imagine that you have a child 6 or 7 years old now. Wonderful. And his path of development is determined by a 70 or 80-year-old grandmother with her lack of knowledge, no internet, no philosophy, no nothing. Grandma says this is how you will do it, and no other way. But thank God there are fewer and fewer such grandmothers. We, loving them very much, don't really listen to them because we realize that everything is completely different with grandma. We have long since gotten away from what grandma is talking about. But sometimes such a thing happens when a child is not to blame but the fault of the conditions that make possible the grandmother to tell the child how to live in the future, what to be when he is 30 years old, 40 years old, and so on. Well, it's funny, of course, but also sad. So the school, this is the very first condition. It is built as a movement from the past through the present to the future. Any concept, the second phenomenon related to it is that any topic is built up as a system of counterbalances, a system of paradoxes, a system of incredible discoveries. Because there is no one-dimensional concept, no one-dimensional knowledge. It is multidimensional, multivalent. And that's when the real fun of knowledge begins. When you, having just been told about the golden section and having lined up several golden sections in your geometry class, suddenly look at Pushkin's novels, read some of his verses, and you see that what you had lined up completely corresponded to the poetry. Or a music teacher comes in with Mozart's music and says, look, let's find out where the golden ratio is. He starts playing, showing the number of bars, and the children have, yes, the golden ratio, the proportions of the golden ratio. It's phenomenal, you know. So I just proceed from the idea that in a school, my school, there should be one lesson. It is modest so far. 1 hour long, or 1 day long, or 1 week long. It depends on the data to line up, and it was called by me and the teachers a comprehensive waveform lesson. Why comprehensive? Because math and music and physics and chemistry and philosophy and natural history and nature appreciation and psychology and pedagogy and so on and so forth are all involved. They participate very unobtrusively because one and the same phenomenon demonstrated at different angles turns out to be connected with geometry, with mathematics, with geography. And then the second formula of my school is born. What does a school consist of? Then consists of geography, history, science, and culture. The humanities part right now. The humanities part I'm talking about, well, I was just talking about math. You know what I mean by the golden ratio and so on. So look, what is real education from my point of view? What is geography? It's a place. What is history? It's time. What is art, particularly music, poetry, literature? It is the filling of place and time. In this place, in this time, so any geographer who will talk about Africa and won't talk about music and won't talk about ancient pictorial totems and won't talk about ancient religions, ancient worship, incredible peculiarities. I just continue that line. I could mention not Africa, but Holland, for example. It's called Netherlands now. Now they ask you not to call it Holland. Netherlands, yeah. So practically in my class, the transition from any subject to any subject is instantaneous. All the teacher and parents have to do is to understand the connections between these or those phenomena, concepts and forces. Once the child begins to understand, not just learning begins, but a funny, phenomenal game. Do you know how many people on the globe are playing these games at home under the impression of my talks and lectures? These games are connected with associative thinking, and this is the main form of thinking. Not clip consciousness, not separate pieces, which in fact are annoying, but associative thinking, the connection between time and place. That is, time is history. Place, as you remember, is geography. And filling this place and this time, in this time, in this place, the following kind of music was written. And that's when we fulfill a huge complex function. We're building a whole city that has a time, has a place, has music. Now we begin to find out together with the music teacher why composers began to write such a music, why polyphony was replaced by homophony. Why did this happen? And eventually we come to the conviction that everything in school is called a subject except one thing, except art. Art is not a subject, and that's even more interesting, because in a subject, you remember we were taught it at school, each subject is a movement from simple to complex. A little kid comes to first grade, takes little sticks to count. One stick, add one more, that's 2 sticks, and so on. 2 sticks, add one more, that's 3 sticks, and so on. So that's what? It's a simple thing. Now how much would it take for this child to reach integral calculus? For a huge path, but it cannot be found in music. Cave paintings are in fact equal to Picasso's paintings. The most intricate time in music was the time of polyphony, not monophony. Monophony is easier, and it was only some 300 or 400 years ago that real monophony appeared. Single voice homophony, that is, was just accompaniment. And before that, there were endless intertwining voices. The ear couldn't even catch it as a whole, but everyone was forgiven by religion, because it's Psi. If you don't understand it, this means it's a divine music, it's God's music. You little earthworms can't understand God's plan. And only Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, Guillaume de Machaut, all these brilliant composers of the 14th, 15th, 16th century communicated with God, and nobody interfered. If you look at the paintings now, an expert in painting will come and say, look at the faces of the people in the paintings. You'll be shocked. The faces don't express any feelings. Remember, pale, emotionless faces. The music is played and the listeners, they sit like this. Like this. Do you know why? Because back then, at that time, the power and influence of hearing was enormous. Back then, everything was perceived only by hearing. The most important thing, if you are blind, it is not terrible. If you are half deaf, it is not terrible. That is, if you are deaf, it is terrible. But everything else is not terrible, only if you have an open channel of hearing, because the sermon was read through hearing. Music was played through hearing. Music is played both in the church and outside the church, as a Russian poet Osip Mandelstam wrote. What clashing voices reside in disorderly pubs and cathedrals. This discordance was to be heard by man. What is in this case back again? A school and a comprehensive wave-like lesson. And why wave-like? Because the wave comes like this. One, it comes. It recedes. It's gone. That's it. It's scary, isn't it? Suddenly, just like that, it crumbles. So that's how the comprehensive wave-like lesson is built up. There is a wave of physics or chemistry, a wave of literature, and suddenly at the top it rises, and it turns out to be a poem, for example, Boris Pasternak's Venice. Now it was silent. To the handle its fork was stuck in morning haze. The Grand Canal, obliquely grinning, kept looking back, a runaway. There is a terrific feeling in the poets, the great ones, of this infinite phenomenon of connection between all kinds and all concepts with all. These are my initial words about the school.
I was in some kind of a world with Mikhail right now. Like it was some kind of, as you say, sermon, because you get completely immersed in it. And it makes me want to listen more and more, because I feel we've been streaming for some time, but I just didn't notice it while listening to the information you tell. And it seems to me that if there were teachers like you, in today's schools, children would just take the information with their mouths open.
But a school, I'll tell you right away, the school is the most conservative institution, the most one. Because a teacher who has been taught this way will teach a child this way and won't even realize that during this time there have been such changes that it's no longer possible to do it this way. And any disorder is taken as, for example, when I ask a question about Pushkin's poem, Yevgeny Onegin, to one of these literary dinosaurs, I say, well, how is Onegin's patronymic? What's his middle name? They start to remember. They try to remember. What's Yevgeny Onegin's patronymic? Yevgeny Ivanovich, Yevgeny Petrovich. Doesn't even sound like that, does it? Yevgeny Sidorovich, Yevgeny Satisfakovich. Well, how can there be no patronymic? No father? There is a father, but his name isn't mentioned anywhere. His father served for many years and fell in debt, such big and vast, that giving balls 3 times a year, he squandered all he had at last. That's it. It's a novel in verse. That's the protagonist's father, can you imagine? And when I say that Pushkin is joking, they exclaim, how joking? It's a very serious novel in verse. I say there's not a single serious sentence in it. It's all jokes. What jokes? And Tatiana, well, Tatiana's even more of a joke. Uneasily she was expressing her thoughts in mother tongue expressive. Her Russian was yet very bad, as Russian books she never read. How's that? Seriously, how can you cast your favorite character in a way that she didn't speak Russian? Poor Tatiana. And if they found out that Tatiana's letter, which Pushkin supposedly translated, he should translate Tatiana's letter from French, of course, because she didn't know Russian well. She couldn't write any letter in Russian. Imagine Tanya and her mother, who beat her maids for the omissions, and her father, brigadier, who died and rests long ago in the ground. This family, as we see, used French to communicate. Where from? Where did she study? This Tatiana, where did she study? And one more hero. By name he was Vladimir Lenski. With Göttingen in soul frankly, he dandy in his prime approves all Kant's ideas and his moves. Are you guys crazy? Are you taking the text seriously? At 17 he came from Göttingen University, having taken a course in the sciences. Kant's ideas admire. You should read Kant first to understand who is a Kant admirer at 17. And what a horror it is. And Göttingen University, and Pushkin knew this, was a place where the most talented and very mature Russian men came to study. Just one thing to study. They were famous all over Europe for German classical philosophers. They studied Johann Fichte, George Hegel, Friedrich Schelling. They studied the German classics, the most complex ones, the deepest, the most intense. And here Lenski at 17 approves all Kant's ideas and his moves. Excuse me, who from the village sent him there? And how old was he when he was sent to study with a full course of German? Not poor Kant, of course, but poor Lenski. And so on. You know how many protests I get from teachers who didn't know it, didn't think of it. It causes a big storm in their souls. Who is he? What's he doing? There's Tatiana in the poem, such a wonderful, Pushkin's sweet Tatiana, and suddenly such a horror. I say, wait, I'll tell you more terrible, yet being child. At any year, Tatiana didn't play with doll. It's a horror. Ask any doctor. What kind of a child doesn't play with dolls? Especially a girl. In own family, she was like stranger girl in thoughts quite lost. What's that? Oh, how cute Tatiana is. Yes, it's not that simple. I don't want to get too far into this now. I'm just saying that any thought that interferes with traditional conservative, hardened, dumbed-down textbook is hostile to any teacher in a conservative school. You know how many spankings I get when I sometimes in one of my movies touch on some moments, the humblest moments yet. I wrote a book on this subject, which is called Yevgeny Onegin, a novel illusion, you know. I'm not publishing the book now. I'm not publishing it for the reason that I don't need aggression right now. I can't stand it when I'm attacked by not just one school teacher, but many from many schools of the world, and I won't be able to answer them. Well, for one thing, I'm too old to fight. I've changed my mind too much. Read and learn, including even where Tatiana's letter is from. They probably don't know something because none of their middle school books explain any of this. And this letter is Pushkin's translation from the poems of Marceline Dibord-Walmont, a famous French woman with a more interesting fate. It's almost word for word. Take Valmore's elegy and take Tatiana's letter. You'll understand everything. I mean, another Pushkin's joke. It's full of jokes. Which of the characters in Yevgeny Onegin did Pushkin pay the most attention to? You'll never guess. Well, try and remember there are 4 of them. Tatiana and Olga Larinsk, Yevgeny Onegin and Vladimir Lensky, and some more heroes. Which of the heroes got the most lines?
Second, just analyze and assume that it's none of the above.
Yet for you, absolutely no one. A completely unexpected hero, the second Zaretsky. You realize how Alexander Pushkin mocks us about Tatiana, not a word about her education. Onegin little by little learned something and somehow. But who was his teacher, the abbot? And why, where did Mr. Abbot come from as a teacher? He fled from France to Russia, and before that, having paid for something, having signed something, he received the title of abbot, as if he had an abbey there in France. The number of French abbots in Russia exceeded the number of abbeys in France, and they all came to Russia. So Onegin came from a noble family and had an abbot as a teacher, but the abbot was a Frenchman. And France, a freedom-loving country. Why was he banished from the court? Look, it's a completely different book. He was banished, Monsieur l'Abbé. He was banished because he started talking nonsense in Russia. In Russia, everything is clear as it should be. Do you understand? And he started talking about freedom, equality, fraternity. What freedom, equality, what the hell, what brotherhood? Between who and who? Do you understand? I mean, it turns out that if you read Onegin correctly and intelligently, it would be a reading for a few months. But it's a worldview, it's a look at today, at the past, at the present, at the future. Then we begin to realize that it is very topical, very witty poem. I repeat, Pushkin did not write a single serious stanza there. Not even skis breathe autumn air out. By then the sun did not abound. Time of a day was getting short. The geese flew high with mournful cries. Birds are flying south. It's a continuation of the first stanza. And the first stanza is connected with the fact that everyone is leaving. Pushkin saw everyone off on the Kronstadt island. And from Kronstadt they boarded a ship, but Pushkin couldn't leave the country. There was a gloomy time of year. November was already near. It was already cold in Russia. And they left St. Petersburg. Skies breathe autumn air out. By then the sun did not abound. Time of a day was getting short. And all his friends, where did they go? To Nice, to Baden, to all those Baden baths. Then they'd go even further south, to the very south of France. And they traveled Europe. They spent much time in Rome. And in Rome, you know, it seldom snowed. They never saw snow. And so Pushkin would come back dejected. They parted, had some champagne. Then they sailed away to the sound of the orchestra. Alexander Pushkin, poor with no permission to leave Russia, returned home. That, by the way, is the reason why he wrote those awful poems. He wanted to please the Thessa so that the CR would say, well, he's not at all what I thought he was. Not a libertine, not a blabbermouth. That's why I let him go for a walk in Europe. But he didn't. I mean, look, I've specifically tried only one sphere now, literature, Yevgeny Onegin. And suddenly it turns out that there is so much behind this novel in verse that I would be telling you now for many evenings, days and nights, and it would be more and more interesting. That's what school is in my mind, and why the teachers of today's school would be angry with me. Because they know for sure that Tatiana is a Russian soul, and they haven't read it. That's not what it says. Remember, Tatiana, the bracket opens a Russian in her soul. Herself, she doesn't know why. The bracket closes. With all her cooling beauty, Lone did like the Russian winter fine. Wow, what a focus. There's a great difference between the slogan Tatiana is a Russian soul and Tatiana, who is Russian without knowing why. Because she didn't know Russian well. She didn't know Russian well. That's the patriot Pushkin. He introduces the main character, a young lady, and if I start doing research on what Tatiana read, you'll feel bad. It's not my idea. Pushkin came up with that, and he writes that her father didn't protest, that she slept with Martin Zadeka under her pillow. That's Pushkin's pun, that the father didn't mind that Tatiana Larina slept with Martin Zadeka. And Martin Zadeka was the head of the Chaldean sages. How she got this terrible book, fortune-telling, witchcraft, just merchants traveled around. They bought some bad goods in St. Petersburg for nothing and then went to the province to sell it to the nobility for 3 rubles. The books that nobody wanted. And ladies in villages read anything. So Tatiana chose Martin Zadeka, the head of the Chaldean sages, to sleep with and kept it under her pillow, as she loved him so much. So she read not Byron, not Shakespeare. She read Martin Zadeka. That is the most horrible reading that a person can think of. Pushkin writes about it. Does it mean he hates Tatiana? No, he just laughs at her education, at her upbringing, at the measurable stupidity. He loves his Tatiana, but if he mocks, that doesn't mean he doesn't love her. No, he loves her, but he laughs at her. He generally liked to mock both women and men. The men would challenge him to a duel and the women would get angry with him, sulking until he kissed them. Here's one of a school moment for you. What is school? It's life, it's warmth, it's a sense of humor, it's charm.
We have a special question from Shanet's studio. As you may have noticed, we have prepared a series of lectures and films in translation, your lectures translated into English. There are lectures by Mikhail. There are other speakers, and we did it with the help of artificial intelligence, neural networks. And I would like to ask, what is the role of an artificial intelligence in the school of the future? At this point, do you see any place for it?
I do. There are things that exist only because people think subjectively and think that their thought is right. And a thought can be so wrong and so subjective, right? That makes me scared for the future. So artificial intelligence to some extent can balance a whole range of information and build it in a logical way, in a logical way. That is logic, superhuman logic, logic where the subject and the predicate coincide. That is, one follows from the other, and so is the logic of my school. Because here it is the movement from left to right, from the past to the present to the future. Here I think that artificial intelligence, when it develops, will not replace humans. It will not replace humans. For example, in such a sphere as art, it's impossible, it's not possible at all.
This is a splendid conclusion. Dear friends, if you still have any questions, you can write them down below. Of course, we will answer them all. And Mikhail, thank you very much again for coming and taking the time for us.
You're welcome. You're welcome. See you again.
See you again. Bye, everybody.